Hello again. To conclude Chapter 20 in the Progressive Era, we will go over the policies of Woodrow Wilson, who is now the new president, in March of 1913, and the big difference between Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson is that Wilson does not believe regulating these trusts is a good idea. He wants to eliminate them and abolish them. And that is a huge difference between the Democrat Wilson and the Republican Roosevelt and the Republican Taft. He declared it was not a day of triumph when he took office, but a day of dedication. He promised to lower the stiff and stupid Republican tariffs, to create a new national banking system, and to strengthen antitrust laws. More concerned about human rights than property rights. And again, a major difference about how we're going to concern ourselves with the practices of the industrialists. And this is a famous cartoon from Puck magazine showing that Wilson is going to bring them down. A major difference between Republicans and Democrats. He's going to level the playing field for all businesses, not just big businesses, to control markets. He was an expert. Again, he held a PhD in this field. And during his first 2 years, he pushed through Congress more new bills than any previous president. But Wilson's weakness, as we'll see coming up in coming chapters, ladies and gentlemen, he has a fierce and unlovely side. He is a moralist. He is a crusader. He was a very religious man. He prayed daily. He was a Southern Baptist, and he finds it hard to work and to understand people who disagree with him, because he believes he is a righteous, perfect person, destined to be doing all of these things. At his right hand was another Southerner. Wilson had appointed many Southerners to his cabinet. And again, this is the first time there's a Southerner in the White House since before the Civil War. Mr. House, who will accompany him to Versailles after the First World War, he is his most trusted advisor, his second personality, my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. And House helped Wilson to get his proposals through a Congress where many Southerners had been there for decades. And because the seniority system is still pretty powerful in 1913, even though the revolution had occurred in 1910, stripping the speaker of his absolute powers, still the seniority system is going to hold sway into the 1970s. And they are the committee chairmen. And as a result, a lot of the progressive legislation will bear the names of Southern Democrats. Wilson believed that U.S. corporations were misusing the tariff to keep out foreign competitors and create monopolies. Of course, that's what the goal of a business is to try to eliminate competition, because if there's no competition, you can charge the prices that you want. So, in order to lower tariffs, one of his goals, he summoned Congress to a special session that lasted 18 months, the longest in history. And he addressed its members in person. He was the first president to do this since John Adams. And the new tariff bill passes the House easily, and Wilson was able to convince the Senate as well to pass the bill. So the Underwood-Simmons tariff lowered average tariff rates on imports from 40% to 25%. And for the first time since the Civil War now, tariffs have really gone down. And because of that, without this now, tariff revenues are down. This was another impetus for passing the first income tax, and the 16th Amendment will get pushed through. And there you have the different rates. And only very few people were actually even paying this income tax because they're not meeting these thresholds. If you don't make $3,000 a year, which was most Americans, you don't have to pay it. Secondly, by 1913, Wilson agreed that the nation's banking system needed a central reserve agency that in a crisis that could distribute emergency cash, not asking Mr. Morgan to come and bail us out, to banks threatened by runs. Any new national banking system, however, must be overseen by the government rather than bankers themselves, the money power. He wanted a new central bank that would benefit the entire economy, not just the large banks headquartered on Wall Street. And the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress. And it's the same system that we still have today to regulate the currency supply and to ensure stability and integrity of member banks that make up the Fed across the nation. Thirdly, a new Federal Trade Commission and an Antitrust Act was passed. This independent agency is an even more powerful tool than the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Commission, which really did not have much success in regulating big business. Now they're going to combat unfair trade practices and monopolies. The same thing with the Clinton Antitrust Act. They're going to clarify what constitutes monopolistic activities, and they're also going to respect the right of labor unions to exist. They're not monopolies in restraint of trade. So, just 2 years after his election, Wilson announced that he had accomplished the major goals of progressivism. He had fulfilled his promises to lower the tariff, to create a national banking system, and to strengthen antitrust laws to the point where they're going to abolish those trusts if they are in violation of laws that restrain trade. The new freedom was now complete, he wrote, for he had no desire to continue increasing the power of the federal government. The history of liberty, he stressed, is the history of the limitation of government power, not the increase of it. And this is the weakness of the progressive movement, ladies and gentlemen. Progressivism was for whites only. Wilson supported racial segregation, and that society that had been pretty much entrenched now after his administration and had been building all through the beginning of the 20th century since Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Josephus Daniels, who became his Secretary of the Navy, was a white supremacist who wrote that the subjugation of the Negro politically and separation of the Negro socially are paramount to all other considerations in the South. For Daniels and other Southern progressives, progress was possible only if blacks were kept in their place. And this is one of the big flaws of the progressive movement. Nothing was done to further the American political value of equality before the law. Wilson goes even further and claims that racial segregation is not humiliating, but it's a benefit. He's the first president since the Civil War who openly discriminated against African Americans, arguing that segregation in government buildings is in their best interests. His administration also reduced the number of African American appointees to federal offices, and he dismissed African American leaders when they came to meet with him in the White House because he did not like their tone. He found it offensive, and he will do nothing to meet with them in public for the remainder of his presidency. Voting rights will not be addressed until the very end of his administration, and the new leader now of the women's suffrage movement is Alice Paul, who was a New Jersey-born Quaker who had earned a doctoral degree in political science also from the University of Pennsylvania. She urged activists to picket state legislatures, to target and punish politicians who failed to endorse suffrage, to chain themselves to public buildings, to incite the police to arrest them, and to undertake hunger strikes. And in March 1913, Alice Paul organized 5,000 suffragists to march in protest at Wilson's inauguration. And beginning on January 11, 1917, Paul and her followers took turns carrying signs there all day, 5 days a week, for 6 months, until the president ordered their arrest. Some 60 suffragists were jailed, and for her leadership role, Paul was sentenced to 7 months in prison. She then went on a hunger strike, leading prison officials to force feed a tube inserted in her nose in order to force feed her. Under an avalanche of press coverage and public criticism, Wilson finally pardoned her and the other jailed activists. And the 19th Amendment will be passed after the First World War. Progressivism reaches its peak during Wilson's 2 terms as president. People grew optimistic about the economy and an improving society, and after 2 decades of political upheaval and social reform, 3 if you count the populists in the 1890s, progressivism did shatter the traditional laissez-faire notion that government had no role in regulating the economy or improving the quality of life. The courage and compassion displayed by progressives of all stripes demonstrated that people of goodwill could make a difference in improving social conditions for all. Progressivism awoke people to the evils and possibilities of modern urban industrial life. Most important, progressives established the principle that governments at all levels had a responsibility to ensure that Americans were protected from abuse by powerful businesses and corrupt politicians. And this will be carried to its conclusion during the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that ends the progressive era.